Pretty exciting day today. We'll be starting the framework on my street Indy project, and to begin that, we'll be starting with making the suspension jig. Okay, so for a quick recap, I've decided to build this tube chassis for the street Indy build I'm doing. All the suspension for this will be based off the C5 and C6 Corvette suspension, which we have here. So I have the front suspension all set up right here and the rear suspension. Moving forward, to get this thing set up, we need to make a jig for all the suspension and all the suspension points. Now on the front end, we're going to have to mark all these locations here on the top section and then the lowers. And we'll have to transfer that all over to a jig. The other issue this presents is the front of this Corvette suspension is set up for the motor to be right here, which means my frame rails are about 3 feet apart, and that's just way too far away to have the design that I want. So after we build the jig, we're going to shrink them together, maybe about 10 or 12 inches apart, and then from there we'll have to extend the upper and lower control arms out to make the same track width. Moving to the rear suspension, we're going to repeat the same process. However, in this case, the width or the spacing is just appropriate for the actual transaxle for me to run my exhaust through, so we won't have to narrow this section at all. Let me show you some of the hurdles we have with the front suspension. We'll see about making that jig. So to make this easier, I have a complete cutout of the front and rear. So my frame rails are cut off. That way I can capture these top upper control arm location mounting points. And we're going to have to copy the lower two mounting points as well. We're going to have to do this on both sides. So the difficulty with these upper control arms is this all comes out as one piece. And it's going to make it difficult for me to find the actual center location that actually we're going to have to mark off, because this just unbolts and I'm left with nothing but these two mounting locations. The lower half should be much easier. We'll just get a piece of DOM tubing, the same diameter as this, and we'll just mark these out. Put a steel tube in here and we'll be able to weld to it for reference. So I think the first thing is, let's come up with something to mark the center lines for those mounting positions on these upper control arms. We have the suspension broke down. You can see where the uppers were once located. So as you can kind of see my point here is I got to come up with something that comes straight across here and marks the center of it, and also gives me the correct pivot to align up with that one. And these lower sections should be easy enough, just a piece of DOM tubing in here and we can weld that to our jig. So let's see what we can come up with for these upper control arms. Okay, so here's pretty much what I came up with. All the front suspension is based off of this M14 or 14 millimeter hardware. So to come up with that, I have some DOM tubing with 14 millimeter spacing on the ID that'll fit for our lower control arms. And on the top section, we have a 14 millimeter stud with a 14 millimeter DOM tubing that'll fit up and mimic where that upper control arm rotates at. You'll also notice that I don't have the second side bolted onto it. And the reason for that is because for me to make the jig, I need to be able to take this out and pull the suspension away, and I wouldn't be able to do that. If this is bolted on both sides, it would be trapped in there. This is going to stay to the jig. Probably important to mention that the lower control arms on this setup use these eccentric bolts that get your in and out adjustment, and I've just tightened these bolts up in the very center of it. And to make up for this, I'm going to be using these Heim joints. Just going to basically go through that through rod, and I'll get my adjustment through these threads. So next up, this aluminum subframe is supposed to sit level inside the Corvette. You can see I have it level there. All I had to do to make that level is I added a bolt on either side to where that leaf spring used to mount to. I threaded it out to where I got perfect level, and now I got some space to run my flat stock underneath to make the jig. So this is finally starting to look like it's going to take some shape. So I got my flat stock here. I'm going to come up with another piece of this flat stock. I'm going to weld it straight to these bushings that I have up top. So it's about 15 inches. We'll weld that into place. We'll come up with another upright right here that'll go from this plate to that bushing, and I hold that in place and mark those two. And we'll repeat the same process over here, and then again on the other side. Okay, got all my pieces cut. It's going to connect all my suspension points to the jig. These are my lowers. This is the upright piece, quite a bit longer. And here's a front upright piece. We're just gonna weld them to those bushings, and we're gonna do that on both sides now. Here it is, tack welded on both sides. Now I'm gonna have to add some additional bracing from here all the way up to the highest point that I can make on this. The same for back there, up in there. And we're gonna connect these two with the left and the right piece, just to keep all this from flexing when I remove this entire center section. All right, so I've added all the extra bracing to my suspension jig, and now it's time to remove all this old Corvette suspension frame rails and get that completely out of the way, and then we'll move on to the next step. Here is my suspension jig with all the original Corvette suspension and lower subframe completely removed. So this is all we're left with, giving me all the mounting locations that I'm going to need to move forward. Now at this point, there's still a lot of work to do on this front jig because I do want to narrow it at least 24 inches, as well as extend these A-arms to make them stronger. So we're going to have to add a third bar, but we'll get to that in a minute. So I think now that I have this broken down, we're going to move to the back and start the same process there. Okay, so the rear suspension is set up quite differently than the front. If you look down here, that lower control arm and this lower subframe does not sit level. So for this car specifically, this mounting location needs to be level. So I leveled that again just by using the leaf spring mounts right there and leveled it up to this side and the other side, as well as leveling it across the center. So I've cut my top two bushings. They're luckily the same size. The lower ones, however, they're both different lengths and diameters. So this is another M12 bolt. And for the eccentric bolt, it is another M14. So that had to be a different inner diameter for that, as well as the length was different. Another important measurement we're gonna have to take from this as well, this is the tow rod arm adjustment. So we're gonna have to come up with a point for that. And I'll be using this washer I cut. It's made out of steel. We'll have to capture this to the jig as well. And we'll do that on both sides. And because the inner lower control arms are concentric bolts, I'm going to have to transfer this over to the actual jig as well as the frame, so we can still use this setup on the frame. So now with all that work done, it is time to make the jig for the rear suspension. So I have all my uprights welded on both left and right side. I've also added all the cross bracing just to keep everything square. And in here, this is where I come up with the toe arm adjustment. And I just have it clamped together so I can separate it. I have a line mark so I can come back and weld it later, because I'm going to have to remove that so I can remove the subframe from the jig. So now that the jig is completely welded up, I can now come back and remove these two upper frame rails as well as the aluminum subframe. And then we'll be left with just the suspension jig. So that wraps up the rear end suspension jig. Now we're going to move to the front of this and address some issues on the front. So like I mentioned before, since we're making this a single-seater centered seat, the front end of this has to be really narrow. So to do that, we're going to have to move. I'm going to start with 11 inches from this jig. We're going to squish that together and get that re-welded up. So I've cut out my 11-inch sections, essentially cutting my jig in half. But now that allows it to push the two together to give me the distance that I need in the center. Now that I've narrowed it up and welded it back together, I've added this additional space on the back end of it, and I've also added this M14 all thread, which is going to help me extend these lines all the way across to this third location that I'm going to be using here. And we'll be extending these A-arms by 8.5 inches. So you see how this works? We're just going to connect these to the frame, and we're going to do the same for the upper side. I have both the bottoms welded on, and then we're just going to move up and do the same process on the top. So I have the all thread gone through, and I got my next upright cut, and that's going to weld right in there. Okay, the front jig is all welded up. I see I've added a bunch of extra bracing to keep it from flexing. And moving forward, I've made a center line between the actual suspension points there, as well as there. And I did the same on the back, because to make all of this work together, this entire jig needs to be based off of a center line. So let's turn out the lights and I'll show you what I got planned. So I got my laser level set up. You can see that center line runs all the way down the chassis table and is hitting all of my marks for my center lines, meeting right there. It's a further back one, as well as in the back of the car. You can see when I put my hand up to it. and then again on the further back one. Next important thing is measuring the wheelbase. So the Corvette is 105.7 inches from lower ball joint to lower ball joint. And I've got this thing measuring out at 105 even. So that'll work perfectly for what I'm going for. Moving forward, as you can see, I put the engine and transmission up on the chassis stand. I've also aligned it with my center line I used off of the laser level from earlier, and that level's right across the center of the crank. Now on the transmission side, I have my output shafts completely lined up with where they need to be in relation to the ball joints. Now that all this much is done, it's time to bring out the tubing bender, and I'll get to bending some tubes. But that'll be in the next video. So hit subscribe, thank you for watching, and we'll see you then.